Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and in my previous reviews of Twin Peaks, I was being very careful not to reveal any spoilers, and so I was only talking in general about what I think about the show, and being intentionally vague about some parts as not to reveal any interesting surprises and all of that, because that would kind of ruin the show, and so I'm giving a final warning to anyone who didn't watch the show yet, not to listen to all the details of it, because then it would be less interesting, because part of the fun of the show was the mystery of it, and even all those surrealistic elements were interesting because your brain was kind of working to understand what you're seeing, and so if you only watch it after you hear the explanation, then it probably won't be as interesting. And I also want to clarify that I'm only really a fan of the original two seasons of Twin Peaks. I didn't really like the prequel movie and didn't really like season 3, except a few parts which I did like, but most of it was really hard to get through. It really tried my patience, and I didn't enjoy the slow pacing, and even all the surrealistic elements were not as good as they were in the original, in my opinion. And the surrealistic stuff is actually why I wanted to watch this show, because I saw some of the clips on YouTube and I heard about it, and that what made me want to watch it. And also I saw some of the other movies by David Lynch, and I liked all the strange stuff in them, and so that's actually why I wanted to check out the show. In the original, I wasn't disappointed by that stuff. I thought all of that stuff was really good and very original for the time. And also, it did make sense in the end, meaning at first you don't really get it, but then things start to tie together, and then you do get it, and that's why it's kind of satisfying. But in season 3, they added so much more stuff to it, and they made it much more convoluted, and didn't resolve it in the end. And I know there are all kinds of theories by the fans, and there's a very long video on YouTube of someone trying to explain all of it and tie it all together. And all of that is fine. I'm not going to badmouth someone who tries to make sense of all of this. And so that was actually a good video. I watched a lot of it. It did make me notice a few things I didn't notice, and so I did like that video, but in a lot of places I thought the maker of that video kind of did more work than the actual creators of the show. He put more thought into it than the actual creators, including David Lynch, who I don't think really planned all of that stuff to the last detail and in advance and all of that. I think he was mostly making it up as he went and didn't have it all mapped out, and I think a lot of assumptions were made in that video, which kind of reminds me of a conspiracy theory video. You know, those guys who look for evidence, so-called proof, and they tie all kinds of little details together to try to make a point and to prove something, and often it's not really real. It's mostly BS a lot of the times, and I can basically interpret anything I want in such a way. I can pick any show, any soap opera, any movie, and try to find all kinds of stuff in it and to tie it all together and create something more clever than the actual show. So I don't really buy basically half of the stuff he said in that video. And even if it was all true, it still wouldn't justify the show being so convoluted and so unclear. And if the aim of the show was to deliver some kind of message, then shouldn't the message be more clear to the audience? What's the point to try to deliver a message if you're hiding it in such a way that you need an interpreter to explain it to you later? Otherwise, you don't get anything from it. And so I don't really think it would be clever to do it in such a way. And also, why not hide all those messages in a show that would also be fun to watch, while also delivering those messages and those ideas? So that would be a double plus. So I cannot really justify season 3 being so slow and boring, even if all of those theories are correct and there's all kinds of brilliance below the surface, all kinds of genius ideas that most people watching don't really get at first, but still it doesn't justify the show being not so entertaining, in my opinion. You know, the jokes were not really that funny in season 3, the humor didn't work for me, and the pacing was just so long, and so I can't excuse it. I can't say it's actually a good show because it's secretly brilliant without anyone noticing it. So no, I wouldn't agree with that. And especially since there are a lot of other shows which also had a lot of metaphors and a lot of interesting messages, while also being entertaining at the same time. You know, Breaking Bad is a good example. It also had a whole bunch of metaphors and little details and symbolism and foreshadowing and all kinds of little stuff in the background, which makes it more interesting for the people who notice that, but it will also be interesting and fun show for people who don't notice any of that stuff. It will still be a fun show. And yet here, it's not really a fun show, and some people will say, oh, that's the whole point, it's criticism of television and all of that. Well, it's still doesn't justify it. So if the show wants to poke fun at bad television by making its own bad show, then it's still a bad show. So it doesn't matter if there's some kind of secret message behind it, I still would say it's a bad show. There's a reason why most TV shows are not like this. So that's my opinion on season 3. Now let me go back and talk about the stuff that I did like in the first two seasons, which started out as a totally realistic show about a crime mystery. Someone killed a woman and there's an FBI agent who comes to investigate, and it all starts as totally realistic setting, and then gradually all the supernatural elements start to appear. First it's a dream he has, which gives him clues, and what was funny and comedic to me was the fact that he was telling everyone about it, and everyone accepted it as totally logical and plausible. And also he had that Tibetan technique of trying to find the killer by throwing a stone at the bottle when they read the names of the suspects, and everyone accepted that as totally legitimate. And so all those kinds of scenes were really hilarious to me. The fact that the show is surrealistic and everyone reacts to it as if it's totally logical and normal, and so that's kind of like, straight face comedy, like in the Naked Gun movies when all kinds of crazy stuff happens and yet everyone behaves as if it's totally normal. So that to me was very comedic in the first two seasons. And he keeps having those dreams and visions, and he sees a little guy, he sees a giant, and he tells everyone about it. Oh, last night I was visited by a giant and he told me this and that. And so that stuff to me was really funny, and the mystery itself was interesting, and the way that all the clues connected in the end, that's what made it interesting. And especially all those scenes with that other dimension, whenever first it's a dream, then later they actually physically go to that place, so that's kind of like a different dimension in which he is sitting in a room with strange lines on the floor and red curtains, and there's that little guy, and everyone in that room are talking backwards, meaning we can hear the dialogue is moving forward, but it was filmed backwards. The actors were actually saying their lines backwards and then they reversed it, and so it gives a very creepy feeling to these scenes. You can see that their movements are not natural, they sound strange, and the show gives us subtitles so that we'll understand what they're saying. And I think all of that stuff was not just done just for the sake of being weird, but it also showed us something that is relevant to understand what's going on, meaning that that place is outside of time, or time flows differently there. It's kind of non-linear, it's kind of backwards, because all the scenes taking place there actually connect with each other. So first we have the dream scene when Cooper sees it all in a dream, and he sees Laura Palmer in that place after she died, and yet later it's revealed she was also in that place before she died, and so they were actually meeting there in different times from the perspective of reality. So that place is somewhere outside of time, or maybe even moving backwards, and that's why in some scenes he's looking like an old man in that place. They put some old man makeup on him, and they're actually delivering messages from different time periods through that place. And so that explains why they are talking backwards in that place, because time itself is moving differently there, and so it kind of makes sense in the end when you realize all of this. And then later we have that vision with the giant, who also gives him some clues, and he says some things will happen that will make him believe what he's telling him is true. And so that's kind of like, a prophecy. So someone appears to him, he tells him of certain things that will happen, and then when they do happen, then he'll believe that that information is reliable. It's not just some vision, but it's actually someone helping him out from that other dimension or whatever. And also it was interesting how, that giant said, by the way, he's played by the same man who played Mr. Home in Star Trek, so that's also fun. He always plays kind of weird characters, because he looks weird. And it's also interesting how he's the opposite of the little guy. So we have the little guy in the room, and then we have the tall guy, and at first I remember thinking that maybe they are opposites of each other, maybe they are different entities, maybe on opposite sides, and yet in the end they reveal they are one and the same. So it's basically the same character in different shapes, which maybe was too simplistic. I would have preferred them to remain as separate entities, and maybe even on different sides, and then we can say the physical difference symbolizes the fact they are on opposite sides. I think that would have been better, but anyway, later they reveal they are the same entity, and it's trying to help out Cooper, the investigator, about what's going on. And we find out basically there are spirits or demons who are possessing people and making them do evil deeds. Basically it's a classic idea that existed for a long time of demons and dark entities going into people and doing bad things and feeding off the negative energy and so on. So it's not really an original idea, but it was done in kind of a new way and kind of a almost comedic way, because they have regular names like Bob and Judy and kind of everyday names that these demons have, and that makes it kind of slightly comedic at the same time. And maybe it's a good thing because it kind of balances the horror element, because a lot of the stuff in this show could have been really horrific and unpleasant to see, but because it's all slightly comedic, it makes it more fun, in my opinion. And I always say that I prefer all those horror movies which are slightly comedic and not the ones that are just straight horror all the way and just totally disturbing and creepy without any levity to it. And so I prefer it, and that's why I prefer the style of the first two seasons of Twin Peaks compared to the prequel movies, which didn't really have that kind of comedy, and it was much more creepy and unpleasant. And the same with season 3, which did attempt to do comedy, but it just didn't work for me. And so the only good parts were all the creepy stuff, and that's why I didn't like it as much as I liked season 1 and 2, which were a lot more comedic, with all kinds of weird characters and funny characters like the log lady and like that major who was talking about the owls not being what they seemed, and it was never directly explained, but I guess all those evil spirits in the forest can also possess the owls, just like they can possess people to make them do things and all of that. And that's a classic idea that existed for a long time, but the way it's been shown to us in this show, the way it's all been presented, is much more imaginative and interesting than in other movies in which it was much more simplistic. And so I like the way that it was shown to us in a new way. And as for the idea itself, I'm not a believer of anything supernatural. I'm a pretty hardcore atheist, and I don't believe in any unnatural powers and spirits and entities. But I still find all of those ideas interesting. I like fantasy movies, I like seeing all of those ideas in entertainment, and a small part of me maybe does suspect maybe there is something like that, especially because I once experienced something called sleep paralysis. And that's a long story, maybe I'll do a whole separate video on this and tell you the whole story, but in short, I experienced something that is very similar to all those kinds of stories of demons trying to possess you and trying to scare you and trying to feed off your fears and your anger and all that kind of stuff. And that experience also was very similar to the stories of alien abductions. And that's when I realized that it's probably all connected, that probably all the people who tell us about their experience of being abducted by aliens, maybe they also experienced sleep paralysis, which maybe was much more vivid, much more powerful for them, and that's why they really believe it really happened. And some people think it's attacks by demons, it's a spiritual battle and all of that. And I experienced it myself, and when it happened to me, it really felt so real that I almost believed there is something supernatural. But then when I read all about it, and I figured it's probably just some kind of hallucination, some kind of delusion, and maybe because all our brains are similar, so a lot of people have very similar experiences, and there is no actual proof there is something supernatural in all of that. But still, I remember how realistic it seemed at the time, and also because all those other stories by other people are also so similar, it makes me suspect maybe there is something in it. Maybe it's not just a hallucination. Because, if it's just a dream, then how come so many people had the exact same dream? It's kind of suspicious, and so some small part of me thinks maybe there is something to it. And we had so many such stories, even from centuries ago, of all these dark entities who try to scare us or possess us or all of that. And so that's part of why I like all of that kind of stuff, because I find it fascinating. So when the show started to reveal all of that strangeness, I was totally into it, I was liking it, and they were also tying it all to UFOs and all of that. The Major was studying deep space telemetry and was getting signals from space, which later turned out were coming from under the city, and then later they found that strange cave and all of that. So they were kind of tying it all to science fiction as well, so it wasn't just pure fantasy. It was also kind of tied to science fiction. And one of the reasons that I love science fiction specifically is because through science fiction you can do all kinds of fantastical stories and ideas and make them be plausible, because it's not just some kind of magic thing, but it's something that might actually be real because it comes either from some other planet, some aliens, or some technology. And so using science fiction, you can actually show us fantastical ideas and make them plausible and realistic, and that way it will be much more creepy, because you can think that it might really happen one day, and so that will be more interesting in my opinion. So the fact that we're kind of tying it all with science fiction made it even more interesting, even though toward the end it became kind of totally fantasy. But I was okay with that in the first 2 seasons, and so I was really enjoying all of that stuff in the old show, and the fact that it was slightly comedic was even better, as I explained. And when they were showing us that entity called Bob, which was possessing people, I didn't really like the way he looked. Honestly, I thought he should have looked more creepy. He just looked like some guy off the street who was just acting crazy, and he was kind of overacting, and so that was kind of silly, maybe too much, because I would have preferred that he would actually look scarier. And that's actually something that I liked more in season 3, because when they showed those demons in season 3, they were covered with black dirt or something, or oil, and they were much more kind of creepy looking, even though they were still looking like people, meaning they looked like homeless people or something, but at least they kind of made them dirtier and stranger. And so in that episode, I think episode 8 of season 3, when they were kind of going around scaring people and crushing people's heads, and one of them was talking through the radio in a very creepy way. So I found that much better than how they did Bob in season 2, but it was still kind of little bit silly in how they just look like homeless people or something. And so I think maybe they should have made them look more demonic, more scary, and not just like people who are dressed strangely and dirty and all of that. So that's a minor nitpick I have with all of it. And the way Bob was in season 2, that he was kind of laughing all the time, it's kind of like the Joker in Batman, you know, just a crazy maniac who just wants to abuse people and all of that. And I guess that's the whole idea. He's kind of an agent of chaos, and he's possessing people and influencing people. And so it became obvious the whole show is kind of more about the spiritual battle that the town is going through, that there are all these demons on the one hand, and there are the good spirits who try to help out the investigation, and that Laura Palmer was kind of in the center of all of it, that she was a very conflicted character, and it was obvious from the start when we were hearing other people describing her. Sometimes she was described as basically an angel or a saint, that she was helping people, she was always volunteering to help everyone out, and everyone loved her. She was helping to feed people who couldn't leave their homes, and she was helping someone with special needs, and she was basically almost like an angel. On the other hand, it was revealed that she was into all kinds of evil stuff. She was selling drugs, she was into prostitution, so she was kind of both good and evil in the same time. And also from her diary we learned that she was very conflicted, that she had a dark side and a good side, and basically she was in the middle of this spiritual battle between the good and the evil. And then we find out that the evil entities were trying to possess her but couldn't, and then she allowed herself to be killed so that she wouldn't be possessed. So basically she was in the very center of this spiritual battle going on in this town. And we see similar stuff with other characters. We see Leland, who is also possessed by Bob, and yet he still retains some of the good in him. That's why you can see that he's mourning the death of his daughter, because he did love her. And so we have so many scenes of him crying about her death, and later it's revealed that he's actually the one who did it, but he regrets it so much, he's crying about it. And so he's a conflicted character, and that's why it's interesting. And by the way, the acting was really good by the actor Ray Wise. I thought he was excellent, and we had so many scenes of him kind of going crazy, and so that was kind of a clue that he's probably the one guilty. And all those scenes of him compulsively dancing also ties with what we saw in the Red Room when the small guy was dancing for no reason, and so that ties with Leland dancing all the time. And so there were all those little clues which all tie together in the end, and that's what I think makes it all interesting, because it wasn't just random strange stuff for no reason, but it all actually had some kind of meaning, it all connected in the end, and that's what makes it brilliant in my opinion. And that's also something that wasn't as good in season 3, even though there are all those theories and explanations trying to explain and tie everything together, but it's not as good. Even if I buy all of those theories, it still wouldn't justify the way that season was just not entertaining, unlike season 1 and 2, and it kind of became too convoluted. And I'm not against convoluted storylines, I love it, but it has to make sense in the end. And at least season 1 and 2 did make sense. Despite all the strange stuff, it all made sense in the end, and that's why I really like it. And there was also the epic cliffhanger of season 2, which I really liked, because after Cooper goes again into that place with all the strange spirits and demons, and he meets Bob, and he sees his own doppelganger, his own dark side, you can say. And in the end he seemingly defeats them and escapes, but then the final scene of the show reveals that it's not our Cooper, that Cooper was basically possessed by Bob, who is now in his body just as he was in Leland previously, and the real Cooper, or his soul, is still stuck in that strange place. and unable to live for 25 years. We are told that in the dialogue in season 2, so it was neat how season 3 continues exactly 25 years later, so that's something that I'm happy about, even though season 3 I think is disappointing, but I do think it's a good thing it exists. I do think if it didn't exist, that would be super annoying to have such a cliffhanger ending in season 2 and never knowing the continuation. And especially because Cooper was such a lovable character, he was so good-hearted, he was so friendly and so good. It would have been terrible if we never got any kind of continuation, and if we just think, okay, he turned evil in the end and that's the end of the story, so he's now evil just like Leland was, and he's going to be a serial killer now and whatever, and the real one is stuck in that other place, or he's basically dead or whatever. And so that would have been such a sad ending, basically, which sometimes can work. You know, a sad ending sometimes is better than a good ending, but it would have been unsatisfying. So I am glad that season 3 does exist, even though I'm a big critic of it, but it's better than nothing. And it did have some good scenes, and toward the end, Cooper did return to himself in the end of season 3, and so I am glad that it exists. Otherwise it would have been really frustrating to not have any continuation of whatsoever. And it's funny how after the show ended, they made a movie with all the same actors, and yet instead of continuing from that point, they made a prequel instead. So if I would have seen that back in the day before season 3 existed, I would have been really annoyed by that, of why the hell didn't they continue the story and just left it hanging. And also I think the prequel wasn't really necessary, because it didn't really show us anything that we didn't know already. It did add a lot of details, a lot of stuff that was later explained in season 3, all that extra convoluted stuff, but it wasn't really necessary, and it wasn't really that good in my opinion. And the whole movie was much darker and more depressing, and also didn't really have all the comedy of season 1 and 2, and so I just didn't like it as much as I did the original Twin Peaks show, even though it did have some interesting scenes. And also it didn't really work well as a prequel, because everything didn't really look the same. You know, the sets were not the same sets, the actors all looked slightly different, they aged. It wasn't really good as a prequel, and it was kind of unnecessary, because we heard all about it in season 1 and 2, so what was the point to show us what we know already? So I'm not a fan of that prequel movie, which is called Fire Walk With Me, even though there are some interesting scenes and some good acting and all of that, but it's not really necessary. Unless you want to understand season 3, I guess, which does explain some of the stuff that that movie raised, so it all tries to tie together, and there are a bunch of new characters and new spirits and new demons and whatever, and so season 3 kind of tries to make sense of all of it, but it also adds even more stuff on top, and it's not fully explained in the end. And maybe they thought they were going to make more seasons, and so they added a whole bunch of new stuff and more convoluted stuff. And also there were so many plot lines which were not connected to the main one, and all kinds of random stuff which was just there, and I feel as if it's just filler. I didn't like all those little subplots which are not tied to the main one, just like in the latter half of season 2, which had all kinds of random stuff which was not connected to anything, and I'm not a fan of that. And so I feel the same way about season 3, which had a whole bunch of scenes which were totally pointless in my opinion. To me it feels as if it's all kind of improvised, it's all made up as they go, and I don't believe it was all planned and mapped out to the last detail from advance, like that guy on YouTube who tries to explain everything, and he claims it's all part of some masterpiece in which every little detail was planned in advance. I don't buy that for a second, and I watched some of the behind the scenes of the show, and even some of the actors said that when they were filming some of the scenes, they were kind of improvising stuff, trying stuff out, and so obviously it wasn't planned in advance. Maybe some of the details they did try to connect and explain later, but they were not planned out in advance. And it seems to me like a lot of things in season 3 specifically were kind of a retcon. For example, we have that scene when the giant looks at the stuff that happened on Earth when there was the nuclear explosion, and then apparently that released all those demons into humanity, and then he kind of conjures up the spirit of Laura Palmer and sends it to Earth, and so it's almost like a religious symbolism similar to the Jesus story, as if Laura was sent to Earth to correct that mistake or to balance it out with all those demons running around. Maybe Laura Palmer somehow corrects all of that, and so that's almost like a Jesus metaphor, that she's some sort of angel or something that was sent to be sacrificed in order for her to die and to save humanity somehow. And I'm not necessarily against that idea, but it's obviously a retcon. It's obviously taking some small story from the old TV show and trying to turn it into something much bigger, much more epic, having to do with, the fate of all of humanity. And so it just doesn't feel natural to me. It doesn't really feel believable to me. And also, I didn't like the very end of the season. I did like the part when Cooper apparently goes back into the past and saves Laura Palmer, and then we see everything changing, her body disappearing from the beach, as if she never died. And so that was actually a happy ending, so I was enjoying that, and somehow they made the actress look younger. I don't know if it was CGI, or maybe they filmed that part with her in advance and then simply put him in, and the older Cooper into the scene. I'm not sure how they did that, but that was actually an interesting scene which I was enjoying, and I was thinking, oh, so they're going to end it with a happy ending, but then in the very end there was kind of a twist that they're now in a new timeline in which she never existed, and then she screams in the end as if something terrible happened. So maybe he actually made a mistake by trying to save her, because he kind of is undoing what was supposed to happen, because the giant sent her to Earth deliberately, and him changing what happened to her maybe will screw up all of humanity. So who knows? I guess maybe we'll never know, because there probably won't be a continuation. So there's a lot of stuff to discuss, and I like that. I'm not demanding everything to be explained to me. I don't want to be spoon-fed, and I don't want all the answers. I'm okay with ambiguous endings and open-ended stories that we can debate about and interpret and all of that, so I'm fine with that. But this was kind of all over the place, too much random stuff, too many things that don't connect with each other at all, and so it's all up in the air, and so we can literally invent 100 different theories to try to explain that. And that's also something I dislike about that video of that guy who claims to have all the answers. He claims to know the real intention, the correct answer to everything, and he talks about it as if it was all planned in advance, which I don't buy. And I'm totally okay with people making those kinds of videos, and I did similar kinds of videos myself, talking about Star Trek, inventing all kinds of theories to try to explain away mistakes and continuity issues throughout the Star Trek franchise. But I always said that's just a video for fun, that I'm making it up to try to tie it all together and to invent excuses, but I never said I think that was the actual intention by some of the writers or producers or whatever. I always said it was never intended by anyone making the shows. It's all my invention. It's all my theory to try to make sense of it all, and it's all just for fun. So I'm okay with people making videos like that, and they can be very fun, but don't claim as if that's the only real correct theory behind it all, when a lot of it was kind of a stretch. A lot of the things they tried to tie together didn't really make sense, and were so convoluted and so loosely based on the so-called evidence that I just don't buy it. And I watched some of the behind the scenes of the shows, and a lot of the actors said that they were improvising a lot of that stuff and inventing it as they went, and so obviously it couldn't have been planned. Maybe they did try to connect it all in the end, but they didn't do a good job in my opinion. So a lot of random stuff which didn't connect to anything, and maybe they were planning to do more seasons and to explain it later. Maybe they didn't want to solve everything, and that's okay, but it was too much of a mess in my opinion. And some people might enjoy that, some people enjoy the random stuff, which is kind of like watching a dream, which is also a line I think in one of the shows, that we live in a dream world, and the show itself is a little bit like that, because you know how in a dream a lot of times things don't make any sense, that all kinds of random stuff is happening, but you can try to interpret it as if it's all symbolism to something, and sometimes it is, sometimes it's not, and it's fun to try to interpret all of that. And so maybe that's what the show was trying to do, make it like a dream in which all kinds of crazy random stuff happens, and some of it might have some meaning and some of it might not, and so it's up to us to try to make sense of it if we want. And so I guess it can be entertaining, but I personally would have liked it much more if things did tie together and did make sense more than they did. And the last thing I want to talk about in this video is the so-called messages that Lynch was trying to convey through the symbolism in this show. And the guy who made that long video claims that the whole point was to make kind of a statement about TV violence and how TV can influence humanity. Before TV there was the radio waves, there was that scene of those demons kind of transmitting their evil through the radio waves, and so maybe later television was used to promote evil and all of that. And I kind of fundamentally disagree with the very idea of it, and I hate this idea because some people claim that television promotes evil in society and in humanity, And of course it can do that, but I think equally and maybe even more it can promote goodness as well. And I made a lot of reviews of Star Trek, and I often explained how I think those shows promoted so many good messages of understanding, of anti-racism, pro-diplomacy messages rather than violence. And so I think television was probably a force for good more than it was for evil, because it connected people, it showed people in different countries of other people and how they live, different races that you might have never met if you live in some other country which doesn't have that race. And so you see all the people on the planet as people and not some strange tribe somewhere else. And so it connects the planet, and most of all it just promotes entertainment, which is a good thing. And even violence, even watching violence in some ways maybe is healthy, because that way you won't have to do it in reality, because a lot of us do have all kinds of violent thoughts or urges, and we would like to see some kind of watching a fight or something. But if you watch it on television, then you satisfy that urge, and then you don't have to go and look for it in reality. So in many ways I think television and all forms of media were probably more positive than negative. So I would disagree with this so-called message that television is a bad thing, and also that whole idea of the nuclear explosion releasing all the demons into humanity I think is ridiculous, because as I talked earlier, I think a lot of those stories about demons and spirits existed for centuries before any of this technology even existed. And so it's kind of ridiculous to suggest that it all entered to humanity because of the advancement of technology. And I don't like technology being demonized in general. I think technology is a good thing, it's a progress. Even nuclear weapons, which is a terrible thing, but the same technology can also be used to create nuclear reactors that can generate energy. And it's been demonized as well, but I do think if it's done safely, it can be a great thing. And for the exploration of space, for example, we can send probes with nuclear materials to power them to the far corners of space, away from the sun. And so this technology actually would be very useful in the future, so I don't like it being demonized so much. So saying that a nuclear explosion can release demons to the planet is kind of a ridiculous idea, and not based on anything real, and just serves to demonize technology and doesn't even fit history. Because are you telling me that there was no evil in humanity before all of this? I think humanity was more evil in the past compared to how it is today. I think humanity overall, it's still far from perfect, but it is evolving and getting better. And so if you compare humanity of today to humanity of centuries ago, I think humanity was much worse in the past. And so this whole idea of technology promoting evil in humanity is an idea that I dislike. And if that's truly the message in Twin Peaks, as that guy who made that long video claims, then I would disagree with that message completely. And also he showed all kinds of clips of David Lynch making all kinds of speeches about various topics, about all kinds of supernatural things, and some of them are kind of pseudoscience. He talks about quantum mechanics and the unified field in physics and all kinds of theories, and tries to connect it all with consciousness and all that kind of stuff. And I personally think a lot of that stuff is complete mumbo jumbo. It is interesting in a science fiction kind of way. Like I enjoy listening to stuff like that because it is interesting, and a big part of me hopes that some of that is true, because that's kind of fascinating. I wish that was the case, but I'm a very big skeptic. As I said, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't think we have any proof of any of that so far, and I hope I'm wrong. I hope one day we will discover a lot of amazing things, but so far it's not really based on anything that can be proved. It's all a bunch of mumbo jumbo. And so if he really believes all of that stuff, then I don't really respect that. I don't think that any of that stuff is real, and so I don't think he's a genius who solved the whole mysteries of the universe and all of that, which some of his fans seem to think that he's such a big genius, and all that stuff he talks about is real. And so he's putting all of those ideas into the shows and the movies. And I'm totally fine with using that in fantasy or science fiction and just do whatever you want in it. And if it's surrealistic, that's even better. I like that. But don't try to say, oh, that's such an important message that we have to understand and decipher, and we have to change because of that and so on. Because the message itself, if he actually believes in all of that stuff, is just mumbo jumbo. It doesn't mean anything, and it's even the opposite message of what I would say, because I think humanity is improving, and the television and media and nowadays YouTube is a good thing for humanity. It helps to connect us all. We see people from different countries, we can talk with people all over the planet, and we can connect with each other, talk directly to each other, and so we're becoming friends with people in other countries. We're all getting connected much better, and overall I think it's a good thing, and it helps prevent racism and hatred of different groups. You'll get to know people from different groups, so that's all a good thing. So claiming that all of this is evil somehow is the opposite of reality, in my opinion. So these are my thoughts about all of these issues. Let me know what you think, and we can continue the discussion in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you liked it, hit the like button, click the notification bell to see updates of new videos. Make sure you're subscribed, check out all the links in the description below, and I will see you all next time. Bye bye.